Hi there, I'm Cecília Vilela and I'm here to share with you an insight into my research on the artist Hupe and her work that is now part of a scala called Notas de rodapé para uma cartografia triangular, translating as footnotes to triangular cartographies. Hupe is from Rio de Janeiro in Brazil and lives in Berlin, Germany. Her artistic practice is highly research-based. She often draws from historical reports and references to discuss topics related to migration flow, religion, the environment, and many others. But she seems to always approach her themes as intertwined with the history of colonization. Notas de rodapé is the result of a research that started in Bahia, Brazil, when Hupe took part in the artistic residence Vila Sul, organized by the Goethe Institute in 2018. Branching out from the same research, additional works were later created, and the wider series is now named after the same title, only then plural. Footnotes to Triangular Cartographies is the name of the wider series. While the creation of this piece was inspired by that earlier moment in Bahia, it was only at a later stage and within a new context that its key element was incorporated, the footnote. The piece you see here was finally conceived in light of Hupe's artistic residence at the Goldhaus in Berlin in 2019, so a year later. The work is composed of wooden boards. It includes 3 large portrait-oriented panels, plus one narrow and long landscape-oriented board below the other 3. Now, looking into the 3 main panels first, they present triangular correspondences between nothing less than 3 elements each. Each panel is associated with one orisha, which are deities in the Yoruba culture, and their correlation with a natural element. So the panels cover Shango, Oshun, and Iemanjá, respectively, through the representation of a palm tree, a river, and the sea. Each panel is also associated to one place, covering Cuba, Nigeria, and Brazil. And each one also touches upon references of the history of colonization, the Atlantic slave trade, and the shaping of the Afro-diasporic identity. Now, the use of a system of correspondence suggests a Western framework of philosophical thought and systems of knowledge. However, the work also expands from such a notion, insofar as, yes, it does present historical references in a style that appears to be analytical, but whose organization is in fact guided by the artist's personal experiences and free associations. It is quite customary for Hupe to explore free associations that approximate historical research to a universe of less stringent possibilities, which, after all, is the universe of visual arts. Now, moving on to the 4th long panel, it reads, "The continuation of the world depends on our ability to revive beings and seemingly lifeless things." This, which reads as a closing sentence in the work, is inspired by the ideas of Cameroon intellectual Akili Mbembe, and it brings a whole layer of meaning related to post-colonial theory and necropolitics. But the mention to reviving beings and things that seemingly have no life also alludes to the relationship established with the natural elements presented in the work, the tree, the river, and the ocean, also easily treated in the Western cultures as mere resources. So, this sentence exposes a sense of sovereignty from nature which is present in the Yoruba culture and which also converses with the indigenous cosmovisions, a term so often discussed when studying references of the native peoples from Latin America. Now, when we look at this work in the context of a scala, it is possible to observe the clash between exploring African references as opposed to those from native populations of Latin America, which can be more easily associated with the scope of a scala. However, when we think that half of the people captured in Africa were taken to Brazil alone, which means about 4 million people. It would be silly not to look at such influences as equally important when trying to shift the story of Brazil away from the European perspective. So, in a way, this work invites us to reflect more on where and how stories of Latin America and Africa merge. On top of exploring all cultural and historical references that it does, what I consider most striking in this piece is how it also makes some sort of reference to educational purposes. The panel's aesthetics alludes to school books or even to classic ethnography museum displays, and it has a very pedagogical way of presenting information. There is an object, a pictorial association, a text, and the footnotes explaining them all. When speaking with the artist, she told me about the realization that, as a Brazilian artist working in Europe, and particularly when doing the residence at the Goldhaus in Berlin, where she produced this work, and where she was the only Latin American in the group, she felt it was always needed to explain every single of her references, that her works always needed footnotes, is what she told me. So, in this particular case, Hupe herself first feels the need to bring in the context, and partly because her work is so research-based, of course. Second, she goes all the way to offer this context herself to us in the shape of footnotes in the work. And third, by doing this, she nearly mocks this lack of understanding and this presumed need to always build these bridges herself. And I think this invites us to reflect on the assessment that we make of artistic creations that are framed by a different language or by a different culture, because it is not just a language issue, but creations that are framed by a different culture that we may just not know how to read. And I include myself in that. For me, this work by Hupe has so many important things to say about these historical references that are brought into the piece and explained in the footnotes, but as much as it has to say about the role of contextualization itself. So, in the end, the footnotes shape the core of the piece and of the project more broadly, responding to issues of how to both address and display within an European context matters that are so intrinsic to a non-European culture. The foundations on which these cultures were shaped are different to the European, and so are their artistic creations. And more often than not, explanations of them to an external gaze will require several footnotes. I hope you enjoyed the opportunity to reflect on Hupe's work. Thank you very much.